Good morning. It's great to see everybody this morning. What a fantastic dinner speaker from last night, and I'm really excited for the upcoming day. As you all know, we're going to start with me talking about media and behavioral economics. We'll have Ben Handel later this morning, and then Manasi Deshpande right after lunch, and then we'll have a bunch of student faculty meetings in the afternoon. So without further ado, there's two aspects of social media, and I'll talk mostly about social media, but two aspects that I want to talk about. One is the effect on well-being, and then the second, if we have time in the latter part of this hour, we can talk some about political polarization and political behaviors. So media and well-being to start, give a little bit of motivation. We'll talk about impact evaluation study and the digital addiction study, both of which were on the reading list and you read, and I want to talk about the reading responses that you left in the Google Sheet, and then we'll conclude there. So for motivation, there are long-standing concerns that media can harm youth and adults. And this, some of my favorite examples go back to the radio. So here's a quote from the director of the Child Study Association of America. The radio seems to find parents more helpless than did the funnies, the automobile, the movies, and other earlier invaders of the home, because it can't be locked out or the children locked in. So as of almost 100 years ago, we were worried about the radio and how that was even worse than the funny papers. By the way, Dmitry, would you mind dropping that thing back there? There's a lot of glare we're getting in here. If you stand up, you'll see what I'm seeing.
I'll go work on it.
Okay, thanks a lot. The second is television. So here's a quote from the American Academy of Pediatrics Guidelines for Children's Media Use. Pediatricians are almost universally believe that children's media use negatively affects children in many areas, including aggressive behavior, eating habits, physical activity levels, obesity risk, high-risk behaviors, and school performance. The preponderance of accumulated research on media's various negative impacts on children. So this is, television has been a concern, and this now extends to social media. So here's a quote from Jane Twenge, who's been a prominent researcher in this area. Among teens, heavy users of social media, 5+ hours per day, are twice as likely to be depressed as non-users. Facebook's own research found that using Instagram led to body image issues for mid-teen girls. Screen time in general, TV, gaming, and texting, is also linked to depression, but not as strongly. And you notice that I sort of paused on some causal and non-causal language where there's some, she's being careful in this quote, but probably readers who are not trained in causal inference will misinterpret the quote. So this is the debate that we are having now, and it is a very, very, very serious debate because of worsening youth mental health. So rates, so this is a figure, this I happen to pull out of, I think this is like even from the Atlantic magazine, but there's underlying surveys that you all may be well aware of, the behavioral risk factor surveillance survey, and and the youth version of that, monitoring the future, kind of the standard sample surveys that we have, as well as observed evidence of self-harm and hospital admissions and even suicide, show that we're all doing worse than we were 10 years ago. So this is for high school students in particular, and the rates of different groups of high school students saying that they feel persistently sad or hopeless over the last 20 years or so, and it's going up for everybody. It's particularly high for LGBT folks, higher for women than for men, much higher for liberals than for conservatives, it turns out, although that's not in this figure. And Jane Twenge, again, a quote, there's another reason we would need to take an action. Rates of depression doubled between 2011 and 2019, right as social media and smartphones became popular. And so this is like a key part of the argument that in particular Dr. Twenge has been interested in. that there's this time series relationship, and a natural thing in her argument that could explain that is that that the rise of smartphone and social media is the cause of that. So that's sort of the backdrop. And there's sort of this time series evidence. To go back a slide, there are literally hundreds of correlation studies where you might survey somebody and say, how much do you use social media and how depressed are you? And then you could run that regression, and you get to decide what to put on the left-hand side and the right-hand side, and whichever one gets in the newspaper. You could also do a panel study, like, did you start using social media more this year? And are you more depressed this year than you were last year? And now you got fixed effects, and so maybe that helps. This is kind of where a lot of the literature outside of economics has been sitting. So yeah.
It's a kind of great one discussion point. I mean, I think recently there's also been a lot of effort to create more openness towards discussing mental health and kind of people talking about feeling depressed and sad and so forth. And so when we look at patterns like that, you know, how much of it might actually be patterns in reporting, you know, and in fact, how much of it might even be, like, to the extent that there are real relationships with social media use, how much of it do you think might actually be social media just affecting how people report?
Yeah.
Rather than how they feel, because there is an element of, you know, at least some parts of social media of just kind of being a little bit more open. Even you see other people being open about how they feel and so forth. Is that a valid hypothesis for some of this?
I think that is a valid hypothesis for some of these reports on the surveys. It's also true that if you look at kind of physical evidence, like admissions to hospitals for self-harm or self-reports of self-harm or suicide rates, those are also going up. Yeah. So this is a very serious and unfortunate thing, as I think we all know. Okay, so what we did in the paper that you wrote, the paper that you read in preparation for this, there are a couple papers. The first of them was this work with Luca Braghieri, Sarah Eichmeyer, and Matt Jensko, which we published a couple of years ago. I won't go through it in detail, but there are a couple of highlights I want to hit that could be useful, and then I want to have a bit of a discussion. So we recruited people on, so at a high level, what are we trying to do? We're trying to test this hypothesis that there's a causal impact of social media use on lots of different outcomes, including subjective well-being. And so we wanted to, you know, do this as a randomized experiment as opposed to a observational study. We recruited adults on Facebook, and I'm bolding the word adults here because a lot of the discussion is about kids. It's hard to do research on kids. Some of the discussion is about adults as well, and so our study is just adults. And the setup of the experiment looked like this. This was in 2018, so it was timed around the midterm elections. We recruit people, we do a screening and baseline survey, we let them marinate for a couple weeks, and then we do a midline survey. During the midline survey, we elicit their willingness to accept to get off of social media for 28 days, as opposed to the 1 day off of social media that everybody will have to do. And then we have this deactivation for 28 days. And just to be clear, so we do this willingness to accept elicitation, and then it's BDM, and we're going to choose from 3 types of prices. One is we're going to choose a price of $102 for what we'll call the treatment group, to offer them to, then that's what we'll pay them to deactivate. The control group will receive a BDM offer price of $0, And then a very small part of the sample that's at the far right will receive a randomly selected price between $0 and $170 drawn from that continuous distribution. I'll come back to several points here that I think were important. Then we'll call the treatment group the folks who received the $102 offer price and had reported willingness to accept less than $102. We'll call the control group the folks who received the $0 BDM offer price. So they were not being paid to deactivate Facebook, and their willingness to accept was under $102. And that's going to be our impact evaluation sample. The treatment group, I'll show you, they mostly do what they said that they would do, which is deactivate for that payment. And then we have that group, we measure everybody at end line and then proceed from there. So a couple of things I want to highlight here that I think could be useful for folks in their own work, and other people have used these sorts of designs before us and after us. But some things to mention. So first, I said we let people marinate for a while. A big concern here is, especially because the treatment group and the control group are being treated very differently. Like, you got to get off of social media. If you're in the treatment group, you're also being paid money. You worry about not just attrition, but not just attrition over the 4-week period between midline and inline, but differential attrition between the treatment and control groups. And so one way to deal with this is to have a baseline survey and then have a second survey, which we call midline. And it's only after the midline that randomization, that the groups are treated differently. And the benefit of that is, you might think that there are a set of people who are more likely to attrit. We let those people attrit before we actually do the randomization and treat the groups differently. So that's one thing to point out. A second thing to point out is how this design, and other people have used this again before us and after us, how this design allows us to evaluate a good, both in terms of people's willingness to accept and as an impact evaluation. So like, we have this willingness to accept elicitation on the midline survey. We just ask people, how much would we have to pay you to get off of Facebook? And so we have that distribution, and I'll show you what that looks like right now. We have that distribution of willingness to accept to get off of Facebook, and that's like a statistic of interest in itself. So this is like a histogram, and the x-axis is willingness to accept. You can see that there are a bunch of people below 100 and a big mass at 100. So that's a statistic of interest in itself. And then on top of that, we have, we can pin people down as who is likely to accept our offer price to actually deactivate Facebook. And so we expect that, so we chose a $102 offer price because in our pilots, we saw that a bunch of people had put $100 and there were a bunch of people below 100, and our rough calculations suggested that our power per dollar would be highest given this type of distribution if we offered people $102 to deactivate and then expected everybody whose willingness to accept was with less than that to mostly do so. What does this mean in terms of external validity? It means there are a bunch of people with high willingness to accept that are not going to be part of our impact evaluation sample, and we will have no idea what the impacts of Facebook deactivation would be on that group. Why 102 and not 100 or 101? We just didn't want to be suspicious. Great. So those are some comments about the experimental design. And then, oh, why did we have this third group over here, 0.2%, being offered a continuous offer between 0 and 170? Anybody have a thought on that? Yeah. Yeah, and this is, of course, an ex post thing that people in the study didn't actually know that we were going to have heavy mass at 0 and 102, but we wanted it to be the case that ex post it was incentive compatible to report your willingness to accept anywhere in that interval. And then there could be debate among reasonable people as to whether 0.2% is like enough for that to feel reasonable. And reasonable people may have wanted a higher percentage there. Why do we stop at 170? We have to send people tax forms if we pay them more than $200. And there was a $30 participation incentive. And so more than 170 here would have put us over the tax forms. Any other thoughts on this design or questions on this design? One other thing that I think is worth mentioning, the way that we elicited willingness to accept was an open answer box. We just said, we explained what the BDM process was going to do. You know, tell us your actual valuation. We're going to draw a random number. It's incentive compatible. And then we said, tell us your valuation. And people gave us an answer sort of in some continuous space. And this, again, this is the distribution that we got. There is an active debate as to whether one should use an open answer box in that way versus a list MPL versus an iterative MPL. My sense with this, in discussions with people like Doug and Dmitry, is that we tend to like iterative MPLs best now. Does that square with your views?
As long as they're incentive compatible.
Yeah. What we ended up getting with this open answer box was, as you can see, a lot of mass at round numbers. But also, I think this idea of coming up with your own willingness to accept is an unfamiliar thing for many people. Whereas yes or no, would you take this price is a little bit more of a familiar thing. So that's why I think if I were to do this again, I would do an iterative take it or leave it MPL. Doug, do you agree with that?
I mean, this methodological issue has been in the flux. We know that the problem with MPLs is that there are boundary effects. So people will tend to give an answer that's in the middle of the list. The procedure that I've used several times recently is called filtration BDM. This is when you start by doing a BDM elicitation that is just basically to calibrate. You ask people essentially about their point of indifference, and then you show them a price list, a portion of the price list that is centered around the answer, and said, now go through this list. You can scroll up and down the list, but now go through this list and see whether you agree with all of these decisions line by line. That gets away from the endpoint problems, but still leads people through the contingent reasoning, which is where they tend to fall down. I can't remember the paper that first said a number. Bootcamp is one of the co-authors of the other things. But it's intuitively a nice procedure. But the issue with that one, there's no perfect procedure, right? That's the problem. The issue with that one is you get relatively few people who, when they get to the list, revise an line. And what that means is that the choice is being governed by their initial reaction. And we know that the BDM reactions tend to be biased. So does that mean that that's subject to bias? I mean, any one of these procedures has.
Yeah. So if I recall correctly, the question I asked you to think about was, could you use this type of approach to value to like in some other setting? And did I ask that or not? Okay, I'm seeing some yeses. So I'm not going to catch you off guard by asking you that now. So maybe we could get just, a couple of volunteers. What's another setting where you could use this type of design? Let me get a couple of hands. Go for it.
Could probably do it in
But what's a thing where it would be interesting and relatively feasible?
I'm trying to think of something that might be electricity kind of low. Allow them to stop using it. So maybe, I mean, and here you're taking like the lowest kind of electricity that like those that are not strongly addicted to things, right? So gambling, or you only began using painkillers, maybe that's dark one. So I guess the low end of many addictions.
What are some other thoughts? Yeah.
One thought I had was when I talked to a lot of people who are on them, they have said like, I have to be here. There's like no other place I want to meet someone, but they don't have like the time doing it. So I was thinking that like you could do something like this. I don't know. I think for a lot of the ideas I was thinking about, the tricky part is being able to observe whether people actually deactivate and take that, but like you just want to be able to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. What else? Yeah. Yeah. Let me get one more. Yeah.
Get people to use public transportation. That you can, I don't know, people, it's not really the same type of addiction, but it's that people that have it, and they don't fully realize or think it's everything that's involved, like if you use public transportation, like you get a sister and you read a book or something, so driving your car, and you could maybe tell people they have to like report their ticket or their record of.
Yeah, and I like I like all of these, and Afras, one thing you were saying at the end is important. So I think a key ingredient for this type of design, of course, is that you can actually observe compliance with what people say they're going to do. And so I think that may mean, submitting your tickets to public transit in your example, Afras, or partnering with the actual app that you're working with, or the service that you're working with, or something else that makes it observable. We also thought about doing this for online gaming, and there's some online gaming where basically your play is actually, your logins are actually public. And so that would be another example. I saw a hand. Yeah. Yeah. We just told them, I forget the exact language, but we basically, there's a standard BDM type introduction, which is that like, we're going to draw a randomly selected price from some range. And I'm not sure, I don't think we told them the top of the range because we got a bunch of answers that were above 170. So we just said, we're going to choose a price from, we're going to choose a price. And then, and that's all we said. So in theory, you could take a hard line and say, as long as we choose 0 and 102, like we chose a price and that's what we said we were going to do. You might have the alternative hard line, which is like, you should have way more than 0.2%. And the continuous distribution you chose should have gone way above 170. Again, Dmitry and Doug may have views on that, but this is what we decided to do. Yeah. Cool. Yeah. And I think in terms of other places to apply this, I think it's like, anything where we want to evaluate the impacts, it doesn't need to be an addictive good. It might just be something we want to evaluate. I think, as an example, Pierre-Luc from MIT had a nice, his job market paper was on the apps that basically have psychological therapy. And you might want to evaluate the impacts of that. And then it's interesting, I think, to compare. This design is nice in allowing you to compare, to estimate impact evaluation, and then see what happens after you temporarily are induced to do something or not do something. And so like the long run effects of a temporary intervention, whenever that's of interest, this is going to be useful. And then comparing people's valuations ex ante to the ex post impacts or to ex post valuations is also interesting. Like after you gain experience with a good or regain experience with being away from a good or service, like how does that change your valuation? So I think there's probably lots of things in that space where we could do more. Go ahead.
And such an experiment just said, look, there are two prices that you could end up with. We're going to pick between them by random, but we're not telling you what those prices are. You would be completely honest with me, and it's reasonable to think that their subjective distribution would be continuous.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I look at this and go the other way and wonder why you would think about this.
Yeah. Okay. We wanted, I think there's like an ex post hindsight 2020 thing that we were worried that some referees would apply to this.
Well, that's all.
Okay, so you read the rest of the paper. So let me just flag a couple of things. So first is our compliance rates were quite high. So this is share of people deactivated for the treatment group in red and the control group in gray. And this we measured via by basically looking at people's accounts within Facebook and checking to see if they were deactivated. We got almost 90% compliance, and this was again among people who said we'd be willing to deactivate for $100 or less, and then we're paying them a little over $100, and so we're expecting pretty close to 100% compliance. Again, as you know, with this sort of randomized encouragement design, having a strong first stage is really important for power. Another important conceptual thing to emphasize here. So this is effect on substitute time uses. These are self-reports. Self-reported time on Facebook goes way down. So these are treatment effects. At the top is Facebook minutes going way down, which is exactly what you'd expect. We're paying people to use less Facebook. They do so. Then the rest of this is self-reported what you did with the rest of your time. So people report spending less time on non-Facebook social media, report spending less time online overall, and then say that instead we're watching more TV alone, we're doing more non-screen things alone, and we're spending more time with our family. This is what people say they're doing. The reason this is important is, of course, that we have 24 hours in our day. And so when you get people to do less of one-time use, the impacts that you're going to see on their subjective well-being or political polarization or anything else are going to be the combination of less social media and more of this other stuff. There's no way to like purely evaluate social media without thinking about those substitute time uses. Now we have more recently, we've replicated this basically twice, and in the most recent, we have in those two replications increasingly good measurement of what people are actually doing instead of Facebook. And so our most recent one, which I'll, if I have time, tell you about a little bit later, was a partnership with Meta, where we had a 10x larger sample, and Meta paid for it, and they paid over 10,000 of their users to stop using Facebook or Instagram. And then for a subset of those, we had web monitoring and smartphone time use monitoring, and we can actually see what people are doing using actual data as opposed to self-reports. And it turns out we get a little bit of a different picture. Justin.
Just get an active picture with the denominator, like fraction of the time.
No, I will tell you what we get in because I actually forget what the units were in the original question. It may be that we can construct it and that's not what we did. It may be that we actually can't construct that graph. And part of it's just like, it's hard retrospectively over a few weeks, it's like hard to be precise about how many minutes you were doing different things.
Did you set more?
It may have been. We should go back and look. Yeah. So that again is like part of the issue with this slide here, and why I'm glad that in the more recent stuff we've done it better. I can say that without spilling all the beans on our unpublished work that is still in progress, I will say that a lot of when you pay people to use less Facebook or Instagram, a good deal of that time goes off digital, which is an interesting fact. Yeah. Okay. Those are the key results. And then you read the results of the paper, so I'm not going to go through them in detail, but we had both subjective well-being impacts. Actually, I will just sort of flag, what are the key impacts that I was setting up that we're interested in? So we have a bunch of survey questions on subjective well-being, ranging from happiness to, do you feel absorbed in what you're doing? Do you feel anxious, depressed? And then these bottom three are text messages that were asked on a semi-regular basis over the 4-week period. So everything above SMS, this is asked at the end of a 4-week period. Everything, those 3 SMS questions are experiences in the moment that you got the text message. We combine all these into an index, and that you can see that all but one of these point estimates is positive. So subjective well-being increased when you got off of Facebook. And the treatment effect on the index is about 0.1 standard deviations. In our more recent 2 papers, these positive impacts of less social media use replicate. The effect sizes differ and the significance levels differ, but the positive point estimates do replicate. Yeah.
Can I restart this by annoying
Yeah.
question again? So are you worried at all that what you're changing is reporting rather than experience?
Absolutely. I don't, in this case, I think for the descriptive trends, I had what I felt like was a convincing answer, which is that like at the national level, you can get hard data on the unfortunate physical harms that people do. Here, those things are fortunately rare enough that they are hard to study in an experimental sample. And so I don't have a good answer to that. And I actually don't know how we could do better on that issue. Be open to ideas. Anybody have any ideas to how, like, if we were worried about misreporting or being the treatment of making people more willing to report mental health concerns, like how would we deal with it?
Maybe like if you offer them some voucher for mental health therapy, like they could use it for mental health therapy or some other measure, and
Yeah.
for the willingness to pay lower.
Yeah.
Then maybe if people feel more comfortable. I know that there are some like design that maybe spin certain like sensitive issues where you don't have to literally say I feel depressed, but rather you hide that question not much of the question. You like give an answer to like find all these questions on the scale. I mean, we can do that as all the questions are one about the question. And that's also the way to aspects in it.
What else? Doug, you want to add to that?
I was not going to offer a solution. But I wanted to mention the new work that I told to you about last night, which I think is a note of caution for using these kinds of data. So I'm not a big fan of subjective well-being. I think that there are a bunch of problems with it. One of the problems is that we can't validate, right? We're asking about a subjective feeling. How do you determine whether the answer is right or wrong? So I have a new paper that comes up with a validation strategy. And the validation strategy works like this. You have one survey that describes certain events and asks them, how would you feel after this event happened? Happiness, satisfaction. And then you have another survey that is exactly the same, that instead you ask people, imagine that this event happened to you, and then you are asked on a survey how you feel, how would you respond? And people's responses to the question, how I would feel versus what I would say on a survey about how I would feel are completely different. Okay, so what we find is basically, we call it evidence of self-reported misreporting. So that is a note of caution. People probably report these things incorrectly. We found that it was much more severe. We find it for negative, it's not for positive. So it's not that there's just sort of a general reported happiness. It varies systematically over what happens. So in this kind of analysis, you can't tell where the problem lies. You can't tell which question the problem that's the problem, or whether it's in all of them. But it does suggest that there's a problem with these surveys.
Then I'm curious, did you ask people like within person, you first answer question, how would you do on second if you ask the survey?
Yeah, so we did it two ways. One is we actually have surveys, it's one survey. We ask people, we have different surveys for different events. We ask people the two questions and we randomize the order. And then we do the analysis both within the subject, determine whether there are order effects, and we do it across subjects with the first question only. So it's not an effect. You get the same answer. You find small order effects, but you get the same answer.
Oh yeah, please.
Is there any like worry that like what would be the impact on subjective well-being of just giving people $100? Like if I value Facebook at $10, if I didn't put $10, I got $92 surplus.
Yeah.
And that just increased my subjective well-being separate from the Facebook. Is that at all considered?
I think it is. However, to be clear, it is the promise of $100 in the future at this point, because thinking about the timing, the end line survey is before the money is paid. And so because of that timing, we were actually not worried about this. And also 100, yeah. And I don't think 100, I mean, we could also look just descriptively, this would not be an ironclad answer, but we could just randomize given the promise of $100 in the future. I suspect that would have no impact. And that would be the rigorous way to nail this down. But yeah, we just figured that because it's a promise for the future that we were not as worried about that issue. But we got that question a fair bit, so it's right to bring it up. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you think the fact that you have the midterm in the middle of the fact that so the thing more formalizing during the midterm thinking
Yeah, and indeed, we did this during the election, of course, because a bunch of our other outcomes were political attitudes and beliefs. You raise a good question as to whether the results would be different during a time when social media is not giving us a stream of political information. I think one thing to keep in mind here is that only a few percent of Facebook content is actually news related. So a lot of it is going to be your friends and family doing stuff. And so, you know, even during an election time, most of the, as measured by, you know, viewport view content, like most of it is not election related. So I think that is a partial answer, but the stuff that may impact you may be the polarizing news stuff. So there are several issues here that you've brought up, including the election period, the fact that this is adults all over 18, including ages well over 18. Another issue is the fact that this is short term. So treatment group deactivates for 28 days, control group deactivates for the first day of that. And then, as we said, self-reports. There's a paper that speaks to some of these issues, which you may know, which is coming out, actually already came out. This date should be 2023, which looks at the rollout of Facebook. Have people seen this paper? Raise your hand if you've seen this paper. So a couple of you. So I'll go over just very briefly with the rest of the folks. So you can do a diff and diff around the rollout of Facebook from 20 years ago. So Facebook rolled out to 775 colleges from February 2004 to September 2006. And it's actually stunning how quickly within a college people adopted Facebook after it became available. And then you can match that to the National College Health Assessment, which is a very large scale survey done at many colleges around the country. And so you can see as an example on the right, it was still called the Facebook. And they have a list of colleges where it's available. And so you can go back and scrape when it was available where. And this is stunning. Just read this. This is an overview this is an article from the Harvard Crimson about online social networks from 2004. Includes reams of carefully coiffed, manicured Harvard students. Upwards of half of undergraduates have eagerly signed up in the last week. Primal instincts at work. Wanting to belong, vanity, voyeurism, performing, wildly misleading photos. It would be difficult, if not impossible, to go cold turkey in the face of the Facebook.com. So this is like from 2004, just remarkably prescient about the sort of things that people would say about social media over the next 20 years. Anybody know who Amelia Lester is? She later became, if I recall correctly, the editor of Foreign Policy magazine. So she became like a very big deal in her post-college life. But this kind of quote is important for making this argument that people widely adopted Facebook, and that even at the time, 20 years ago, there were the sorts of issues that existed on the platform that one might still be concerned about today in terms of how it might affect us. And then you can just do this diff and diff. And so this is like, this is our standard event study plots that we would use in any paper. Event time on the x-axis, y-axis is effect on basically an index of subjective well-being indicators. And then each of these different spikes is one of the different two-way fixed effects or event study diff and diff estimators that we're using for staggered event study designs. Now, the key thing is when you look to the right of this, all those point estimates increase in some cases significantly for any given period since the event. So that's Bregery, Levy, and Macaron. I think a really nice really nice paper. But then it's like, this is Facebook from 20 years ago. And so maybe the effect sizes or even the signs could be different. And so this paper also is not perfect. So then you might ask, why are we willing to pay so much for something that makes us unhappy? Or in other words, why do we have, in our 2020 published paper, why is it that people had to be paid an average of, I think it was $150 to $200 to get off of Facebook for a month, if it was something that at least people report is making them less happy? And so that led to this digital addiction paper, which I think takes a different tack on these sorts of questions and does not rely on, there are self-reports in it, but sort of the main thrust of the paper doesn't rely on those self-reports. And so basically what we're doing here, as you saw in the paper, is set up a model where we try to capture what clinicians and psychologists meant by addiction or digital addiction. And it was just habit formation plus self-control problems. And then we have a design that is designed to estimate both the habit formation piece and the self-control problem piece. Question? Yeah. So there are a bunch of experiments that encourage people to do different stuff on Facebook or to stop using it for shorter periods. So, limit Facebook use to 10 minutes per day, and if so, we'll pay you X dollars. Or there's another study where it's like, get on Instagram and then look at specific pictures on Instagram. And so there's a lot of different permutations of experiments like this that get people to either go cold turkey or use less or do something different, as you're saying. It's hard to compare across those studies because they're different samples. It's actually strikingly, we were just trying to do a meta-analysis, and in some cases they don't report the treatment effects and standard errors. They do something different. So it's hard to compare across those. Yeah, so some of this has to do with the monitoring technology that we have. For the 2020 paper, just to go back to the key slide on that, for the 2020 paper, all we had was the ability to access somebody's account and see if they had actually deactivated. And if you had deactivated, then this is what we see for your homepage, and that's how we measure it. For the digital addiction paper, as you saw, we have a app that people put on their phones, and then we can measure time use continuously, and then that allowed a whole series of different treatments that we could implement. Yeah. Okay, so what we want to do here was, focus not on the subjective well-being survey outcomes, but focus on an economic measurement of habit formation and of self-control problems. The two key ways to get at that are a temporary incentive to use less, and then look at the long-run impacts of that. That's habit formation. And self-control problems are, in our measurement of this, is, well, let's give people time-limiting functionality on their smartphones that's better or more salient than what they had already, and see if they actually use that to limit their own consumption. And our key figure that I think really highlights the results is this thing. So this is over the periods of the experiment, the treatment effect of the different interventions that we had in minutes per day. And these are negative treatment effects of reducing social media use. In red, that's the treatment effect of the screen time bonus that you read about, which was an incentive to use less only in period 3 of the data. That reduces use by almost an hour. And then we see habit formation in periods 4 and 5 when the incentive is over and people still have not fully gotten back onto social media. The limit, so that's evidence of habit formation. And then the limit functionality is this, these impacts in gray. People have access over all 4 periods to, in this group, to the ability to limit their social media use. They use it and the effect is over 20 minutes per day. And so this is, we can then, as you saw, go into structural modeling, but like this is the key figure that demonstrates both that we have evidence of self-control problems and habit formation. So let me pause here on that. Any thoughts or questions, reactions people had to this paper, criticisms, and or ways that you feel like you could apply this methodology in other settings? Yeah.
I was curious if you could talk a little bit about the setup of the model for the habit formation and timing consistency. And what I was in particular interested in, not some of the choices that were good. One thing that I like, if I understand it correctly, like the way you think about rejection, sorry, the way you think about habit formation and self-control is that they're separate. Is that my habit does not influence how much of a self-control problem I have. Is that correct?
Yeah, so let's go to that model. So and let me just take a minute to set it up and then we can talk about your question. So we've got periods from 0 to t. We're choosing consumption X, and that is a time use X. And that time use has a price P, where P is usually 0. It's free to take an additional minute on your phone, except in the experiment, we're going to give people a bonus to use less. So P becomes non-zero. And then habit stock is S, and that will evolve geometrically in this way here. So before period T, so then there's temptation. Before period T, we have flow utility U. In period T, the flow utility that I consider for period T is that same thing plus gamma X. And so gamma is this temptation parameter. And then I could be sophisticated or naive about the magnitude of my gamma. For example, I'd be partially naive or fully naive if gamma tilde is less than gamma, and fully naive if gamma tilde equals 0. So a comment here. We chose the temptation good framework. In other words, basically adding this gamma X thing instead of using a beta delta formulation. So temptation good framework, the main site would be Banerjee and Mullinathon's working paper from 10 or 15 years ago. We could have used beta delta. We could have used some other type of formulation or dual selves or something else. When you do it this way, it just simplifies the math. So you may remember from Gruber and Kozagi's, basically a lot of this setup is taken from Gruber and Kozagi's cigarette smoking paper in the QJE. And it actually turns out that when you work through the first order conditions, having temptation, having self-control problems in this framework, as opposed to beta multiplying everything in the future, simplifies a couple of things. We also, there was a conceptual reason why we did this, which is we didn't really think that we were estimating time preferences, nor for cigarettes, honestly, would I think that we're estimating people's time preferences over future consumption of anything, right? So in beta delta, it's like U of C, where C is like consumption of anything in the future. We really thought that our estimates are speaking to temptation over the consumption of one particular good, which is social media, or could have been cigarettes or something else. And so it felt more appropriate to set this up as just temptation over consumption of this good X, as opposed to that we were estimating time preferences over any arbitrary type of consumption. So that's the setup. And then can you say your question again?
So I guess I intuitively think about inertia. I think first time I worked with some addictive substance, I probably wouldn't be particularly tempted to think that I decided my preferences. But the 10, 20th time, this temptation component, basically comes from external. So I'm just like curious if you could discuss maybe the choice a little bit and maybe discuss like the design or if we could go about thinking about the result change substantially. If we,
Okay, so we want gamma. So we want gamma to possibly be a function of S. We want gamma to be a function of habit stock. So, and let's say that we wanted to at least get a little bit of traction on. So with our current design, I think you're right that we could do something to get there. What's your sense of what we could do to estimate how gamma varies with S, either in our current design or with a modified design? Let me put this out for the group. Think about it for a sec. Lester, were you going to answer your own question? I saw half a hand there.
But I do think that you could basically provide where after the bonus, you could elicit kind of the willingness to limit yourself.
Yeah.
And after the and you will observe how that changes with the habits.
Yeah. So we could, just to say that, so a simple thing we could do is we could just ask, how does gamma vary with recent past consumption, which isn't exactly what you wanted, but it's like, could be related to capital stock. It's also observational, not an experimental moment. The other thing that you said, which is going to be lower power, but doesn't have the same concerns about biases, would be to take these type of results, but then specifically look at whether people use their time limiting functionality more or less after their habit stock has been experimentally manipulated. Yeah, I like that. Cool. And now, did that get to all your questions, or do you have one more, Vlasta?
I think that.
Okay, great. Well, you can grill me more at the break. Thank you for those questions. So let me just conclude. Let me show you the key graph from this, and then we'll conclude. So we can use those moments to estimate habit formation and self-control problems, and actually estimate the structural parameters of that model. And so as one example of the type of results we get, we can estimate the effects of self-control problems on social media use, where FITSB is our word for social media, the social media apps, Facebook, Instagram, etc. And this is the distribution of those estimates across the people in our sample. And these are relatively heavy users who use an average of over 2 hours a day. But you can see that in our estimates, the effect of self-control problems or temptation problems on social media use is quite large. So the average of this might be a little over an hour, and the right tail goes up pretty high for some of the heavy users who also reveal to us that they want to limit their use a lot. And so this, I think, in our estimation, I think you would use this type of evidence to conclude that a substantial part of social media use is driven by the lack of time limiting functionality that people feel is effective and works for them. So to conclude, there's some causal evidence at this point that social media reduce happiness and mental health for adults and college students. There's some evidence of self-control problems, but also large benefits from social media as well. And so, how do you trade those things off? Some open questions to think about for the group. What are the effects on younger folks? And there are some groups around the country that are working on this now in hopefully large scale experiments. And so I think that'll be very interesting. What is it about social media that might affect well-being? Is it mechanically just I'm spending more time? Is it the social comparisons? Is it body image? Is it that I'm staying up late at night on social media and it's actually the mediator is sleep? Is it how much of it is about reporting Are there aspects of social media that platforms could tweak to reduce harms, removing the like button, changing the algorithms, the news feeds? And what is it about social media that we do most want to consume relative in the long run relative to our short run selves? I'm in the middle of working with a group of political scientists, plus Matthew Jensko and myself, so 2 economists plus a group of leading political scientists on experiments with Meta where we have varied their news feeds, and parts of those have been released. We've varied news feeds for tens of thousands of people and then measured outcomes on the platform and then political outcomes and surveys and stuff like that. So we have some evidence on this type of question in political settings, but there's still a lot more to do.